All right. Good morning, Doug. We're back with more viewer questions. And before we get started, though, I thought you shared with me an email from Alex Kreiner's subscription service, his newsletter, where he was highlighting, some things that were built into the law, the legal framework, way back in World War One, the relating to the Espionage Act and the Trading with the Enemy Act. And he shared some very interesting anecdotes about what happened then. And I think given the way the world is going, gives us a good preview of what might be in store for us in the near future.
Yeah, these are, I got those from Alex in his newsletter, and they really are ultra disturbing, especially considering this was the pre-woke era. But go ahead and read those because they're wild.
Yeah, I mean, one thing he talks about is that there was a young media director named Eric Posselt who was interned. I mean, he was imprisoned in 1918 over a poem he wrote. Well, it turns out the poem was never published, but the Department of Justice found it during the search of his house. And one report about the event stated that Posselt is not accused of any conspiracy, but is only accused of guilty knowledge. He is very bright in his writings, and it may cause trouble if he's released. And he spent 17 months in an internment camp. There's another one with this guy, Carl Muck, who was Boston Symphony Orchestra director. And apparently he was, accused of not being patriotic American, as he has a German background, and refusing to play supposedly the Star Spangled Banner. And they interned him along with 29 members of his orchestra. And they were there until well after the war was over. So these aren't people who really did anything wrong. They were just, their crime was not even a real crime, but it was guilty knowledge that got them thrown in the slammer.
Yeah, and not supporting the war adequately. And so there were a lot of things. The Wilson administration was certainly one of the most dangerous and generally criminal administrations that we've had. But you think about things that happened in those days, and then you ask yourself, well, it was wartime. Okay, but what was the U.S. doing in World War I? And if you look at the facts, there was just as much reason, really, if you wanted to join a stupid war that you had no business in, to have the Americans on the side of the Germans as opposed to the Brits. There was no point in joining World War I at all. Yes, I know the Lusitania got sank, but the Lusitania was warned. You're carrying munitions, therefore you're fair game. So it was a stupid tactical error on the part of the Germans, but no reason for the U.S. to go to war because a boat carrying, anyway, it's nothing changes. So
Yeah, and then they used the same laws in World War II again. I mean, with the internment of the Japanese, for instance, and 50,000 Japanese were rounded up, lost all of their belongings, and
oh
put in
no, it was
internment camps.
100,000 actually.
100,000.
That's right, and their houses and their businesses were confiscated, and only very recently they got some kind of piddling recompense for that. I mean, it was criminal. Of course, the Roosevelt administration, which is lauded, and was criminal too. So it's actually always been dangerous living in the land of the free and the home of the brave or whatever.
Right. And I think Alex's point is that if in an environment of total war, as where it requires a whole of society, in that environment, there's all kinds of things that the state can do to silence any opposition force that might be out there. I mean, I think I've heard you talk about oh gosh, I'm failing his name right now. The writer Mencken, that during the world wars that he shut up as well, like a very effective political writer, but he knew when these things during these times of war, he kind of clammed up.
Yeah, that would have beat going to jail and having your assets stolen from you. Sure.
Yeah. So anyway, you got to. It seems like we're on the road to something like that again. And so what the normal restraints that people think that the state has all fall away. And I believe even that the Japanese internment case went to the Supreme Court, right? And the Supreme Court supported it, said it was justified.
Yeah, I don't recall the details, but it'd be worth researching to see exactly. I mean, that was absolutely horrible. You're a person of Japanese descent. You're living a normal life in California. They round you up and put you in a concentration camp. I mean, quite shocking for doing
Right,
nothing.
which FDR legitimately called them concentration camps. We're not adding words to that. This is what they were officially called by FDR, concentration camps.
And just a side note, concentration camps as an institution were a gift of the Brits to civilization. They employed that to win the war against the South African farmers in the
The
Boer
Boer
War.
War.
They rounded
Yeah.
up all the women and children because they couldn't get the men. So if they rounded up the women and children and put them in concentration camps, that was one effective way of winning the war. When you actually take somebody's family and put them in a concentration camp, which is what the British called them, and they invented that. So what we know is what the history that's taught in schools is mostly bullshit.
Apparently. Okay. All right. Well, let's get some of these questions. So, first one is Doug, in the US, half the population voted for socialism and the other half for capitalism in 2016 and 2020. And there doesn't seem to be any reason why this voting pattern will change in the 2024 election. This is the source of the underlying animosity of people in red and blue states. Both economic systems cannot exist at the same time in the same place. One will win over the other. What system do you think will prevail in the future in the US?
Hmm. Well, it's not that the Americans were voting for socialism or capitalism, though. I mean, Trump is actually a perfect economic fascist, but so people get these things very confused. But it wasn't the first time. I mean, the election of Franklin Roosevelt in 1932, Hoover was a horrible uh, president. I mean, he was the one that put all kinds of. Hoover actually was responsible. It wasn't capital. Everybody says capitalism was at fault for the Depression. It was Hoover with his agencies and taxes and all this set up. And Roosevelt ran on a platform of reducing these things, and he redoubled everything that Hoover did. So, and he's a national hero. So it's not the first time that Americans have had this false choice between socialism and capitalism. I mean, hey, how about Obama? They not only elected him, but they reelected him. And how
Yeah.
about when Gore was running against the baby Bush? Gore was saying all kinds of green and socialist things, and he actually won the popular vote, although the Supreme Court decided that Bush, they gave it to Bush with that Florida hanging chads thing. So no,
Yeah.
this isn't the first time it's happened at all.
Do you
And
see the dividing line really as that, though, as he frames it, is that there's a side of capitalism and a side of socialism, and then these are the two halves of America that are, at each other? Do you see it in that simple bifurcated manner?
the case can be made for that. Yeah, people that, even though they don't understand economics and don't know anything about the history of the country really, but they're generally on the side, more or less, of, kind of, yeah, I kind of like economic freedom and people that want welfare and so on. So yeah, there is a bifurcation in the country. I think it's been there for a long time, but now it has racial overtones as well.
It does. And those seem to be constantly stoked by the powers that be.
Yeah, and I'm not even sure that when the average American goes to his voting booth later this year, uh, if he's going to think in those terms so much as it's either Trump or no Trump. because it doesn't matter whether Trump, assuming that he's still going to be the candidate, and there's no guarantees that he's going to make it that far. I mean, something terrible might happen. You don't know in today's world. But if he wins, half the country, that the kind of people that read and write editorials from the WAPO and New York Times and the Atlantic and MSNBC and CNN, all that, and most of the people in the cities are going to go wild with hatred against the MAGA deplorables. But if Trump loses, the MAGA people will justifiably think we've got to do something. Our country is going down the toilet. We got to act now. So no matter who wins, I don't see how you can avoid mass chaos this November and before.
Yeah, I don't see either. And I just wonder, it seems the way that the basic trend here is in terms of economics, whether it's what people are really, you have two different groups maybe voting on different systems that they don't really understand, but intuitively want to go in different directions. But it's kind of like whatever they vote on, they get more state control over the economy, no matter what.
Yeah,
Is it that way?
I agree. And as the economy sinks, which I'm well, it is sinking, has been sinking in fundamental ways for many years. But if we have a financial crisis where stock market collapses and interest rates go up at the same time, you can absolutely count on everybody wanting the government to do something.
No doubt about it. Okay. Next question. More theoretical, but interesting. He says, assuming a legitimate common law courts that are independent of the state exist, assuming that, what does Doug think about the idea of individuals posting private bounties for the capture of criminals who were indicted for crimes against the people or public?
I'm all for it. It gets back to the basic theory of what the state should do. And once again, I'll briefly summarize this in 30 seconds. If the state is congealed, concentrated coercion, and that's what the state is, it's men with the power to shoot you and lock you up, then that ought to be limited as much as possible. So if the state is coercion, and in a civilized society, we want to limit coercion, the state ought to be limited to defending you from coercion and nothing else. That implies an army, coercion from abroad, a police force, coercion from within the bailiwick, and a court system to adjudicate disputes without resorting to coercion. And of course, the argument that I make, or that any ANCAP makes, is that those things are actually, they're very important, but they're actually too important to leave to the kind of people that inevitably are drawn to work for the state. So how are you going to collect criminals? Well, a bounty system is fine, because if a bounty hunter does something which breaks common law, he can be prosecuted for his action. He's not guarded by the state as an employee of the state. He has to be responsible and observe the rights of the indicted or the accused. So, yeah, I think a bounty hunting system has a lot to be said for it.
There's also the in civil law in the U.S., it's like it's between individuals or entities, corporation and a person or whatever. But in criminal law, it's always the state versus that person, regardless of who the victim was. Is that, well, it is weird that the state is, in those court cases, is the one on the other side of the case from the perpetrator, instead of it being the person who was punished or the person who was a victim being, suing. You know what I mean? Like, it's weird how the state takes that role. It gets authority whenever a crime is committed. We are going to go get justice for us. So like nothing for the victim. It's not about the victim at all.
No, it's not about the victim. Yeah, and it's always phrased, the people against. So, well, it's not the people. It's really the prosecutor who's looking to use that case to climb the next rung in the political ladder. So the whole system is corrupt at this point.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of evidence of that around if anybody sees any of the headlines, including the stuff, of course, that happens at Trump, but not just that.
Well, that really is an egregious example, what's happening to Trump, where they use the resources of the state, which are for practical purposes unlimited, to go after an individual because they don't like him. It's effective and it's evil.
Okay, next question is, this is a tough one. Who's worse, Hillary Clinton or Nikki Haley?
Tweedledee or Tweedledum, Nazis or communists? It's a bit of an academic question, though, because Hillary is too old and too widely disliked to be a real threat as an elected official anymore, I think. And Nikki Haley is, still kind of in her prime. Well, she's actually not in her prime, but who was that person that got fired from CNN for saying that some female wasn't in her prime?
Don
Lemon.
Lemon? Yeah, Don
I
Lemon.
think so. So, well, I'll say it. She's not in her prime. Let's admit it. Let's be candid. But these are two absolutely horrible people. And wait a minute. There's a third kind of female contender out there, isn't there? Michelle Obama, that some people call Big Mike.
Some do call.
Can she run for the Democratic ticket? Because Joe is not.
There's very strong rumors out there that have been for a long time. And I have to say, if it ends up being true, I will give your wife incredible predictive credit for it, because she first told me about that 2.5 years ago, something like that she thought that that's what would happen.
That the Big Mike would run?
That Big Mike would end up being pushed in as the next president. That's what she told me.
Well, yeah, we absolutely need a Black woman president. I mean, otherwise there would be people offended. Proof that we're a racist country if we don't run a Black woman president of extreme left-wing ideational values.
Well, and you can't, if you're gonna push Kamala out of the way, from a politically correct standpoint, at least, if you do it for anyone other than another Black woman.
This is completely insane, because Blacks are 12% of the US population. So why does everybody have to kowtow to them? I mean, aren't they just human beings that happen to have a different skin color? This is crazy that people think in these terms. Oh, we can't push her out because she's a Black. This is insane. That should have absolutely nothing to do with anything.
They should have been more bothered about putting her in the role anyway when she's mentally incompetent.
A manifestly stupid person. And that's how I would describe Kamala.
Yeah, that's the bigger issue. Forget about race.
Yeah. Anyway,
okay.
Well, listen, I know it's a long shot, but especially if the war in the Ukraine and Gaza and against the Houthis, which nobody even knew that they existed until a few months ago. But now it's like, we've always been at war with the Houthis. They're evil. Like Orwell's East Asia and Eurasia. We've always been at war with them. It's the same thing. I think that a left-wing general could be drafted to run on the Democratic ticket. It's a long shot, I know, but shouldn't be ruled out. because when you have a war, you want a general, kind of.
Mm.
And the US military is the only part of the US government that people still have some kind of respect for. It's diminishing for good reasons, but
What about Lloyd
just a thought.
Austin?
Just a thought.
What about Lloyd Austin?
It won't be him, but maybe Petraeus will make a comeback,
Mm.
or maybe Stanley McChrystal will, or maybe who's that guy that after the Iraqi army had surrendered and the tanks had their turrets turned around and they were all in a bedraggled way driving back to Baghdad, and he basically massacred them.
Mm.
I met this guy at in DC at the National Opera. We were both at a party after the opera, and we had a very unpleasant interchange.
Was that
And I've
Barry
forgotten the guy's
Barry
name.
McCaffrey?
Barry McCaffrey. Yeah, Barry's still out there. He used to
Mm.
be the drug czar too.
Mm.
That was a political plum that he picked after the Iraq War.
Mm. I didn't realize he was responsible for what they call it, the highway of death or something like that.
Yes, yeah, that was that was the feather, his personal feather in the cap.
Gross. All right. So part two of his question, he said, high schools are teaching kids to plot equations of slopes, calculus, and all manner of challenging, but for 98% of kids, worthless busy work. Why don't they teach kids things that really matter, like trading stocks, interest calculations with personal finance, civics, law, and its history, and mountains of other useful things which you deal with in your real life more directly?
Well, personally, I'm all for learning trigonometry and algebra and calculus and things like that in high school. And I recognize that they have no direct application for most people. I mean, I learned those things, and frankly, because I never use them in day-to-day life, I've forgotten most of it. But especially while kids are sponges, and they're actually all anxious to learn until their inquiry facilities are beaten down in the process of being chained to a desk and having, generally speaking, a moron lecture to them about irrelevant things. Listen, this is not an argument against taking algebra and trigonometry and such. It's an argument against sending your kids off to a concentration camp for 8 hours a day to be indoctrinated. That's why kids should be homeschooled. And when the kid has an interest in math, pursue that down a rabbit hole, along with 50 other things. So,
yeah, I mean, I have to say, I think that learning some trigonometry would be more useful than learning to trade stocks. You know,
yeah, it's real world anyway. It's real world.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Next question. Is the average person equipped for dealing with failure? How might we best encourage and train others to overcome the irrational fear of ridicule and loss?
What do you think?
Well, I happen to know this is asked by a British guy, and I couldn't help but immediately think that is one of the unique things about being American, actually, is that ridicule and loss are like, the risk of that is minimized in American culture as opposed to European culture, you know, or Latin American culture for that matter, you know, where like failing is not considered a major taboo. That's why there's so much entrepreneurship in the US, for instance, because
What about the fact that kids I understand, all get participation trophies these days so that they don't feel like they're the loser?
Yeah. Now, I'm not saying that culture hasn't changed. I'm saying that it was there though, where, you know, putting yourself out there and meritocracy, those certainly were dominant. but I don't think they're certainly the trophy culture, the participation trophy culture exists everywhere. But I think the best, when there's a book I read when my kids were really little about um basically not minimizing self-esteem not focusing on self-esteem when kids are coming up, because it totally disorients the kid. Because when they, if you're constantly telling them good job, whether when they do something successfully and celebrating their victories and making it seem as though your praise becomes tied to succeeding in something, then they actually discourages them from trying, because they don't want to not have the parents' praise. So because they don't succeed in the thing, they don't want to try in the thing. So, when you're raising the kids, you just have to, the idea is that you only praise effort. You don't praise result. And I feel like that's that's definitely a positive thing. I see this in family members, young family members who were my nieces and nephews, who were raised a little bit differently than my kids, where they are, they're not apt to try new things because they're told they're great, but they know they're not. They know that they, in their mom's eyes, they can't do anything wrong, but they know themselves that they're not great at everything automatically. And so they don't try.
That's a good, that's a very good point. But to me, it comes back to not sending a kid off to a school, because the problem with going to a school, certainly when they're at a certain age, let's say in between 10 and 14, age of puberty, things are changing, it's confusing. But really at any time, it's that you're putting a kid in a Lord of the Flies environment. In other words, you're putting the kid there with 20 or 30 or 50 other kids about his same age, and they pack up and attack the foibles of absolutely everybody in the group. It's look, it's like that movie with Danny DeVito and Arnold Schwarzenegger, uh,
Twins.
Twins, where Arnold grew up on a desert island where he was learning things and becoming physically competent and so forth, because he wasn't exposed to having to hang around with young chimpanzees who would inculcate all kinds of bad habits and bad thoughts and so forth. And Danny DeVito, who grew up like a normal American, was just an awful person in the movie. So look, if you want to do your kid a favor, don't send them to school. It's a corrupting influence, I think, from the very beginning. Not even because of the teachers. That's the worst part. But because of the other young yahoos that he's going to have to deal with.
Yeah, you have to. The thing is, when you send them to school, and I wish I'd homeschooled my kids sooner. I wish I'd done it from the very beginning. Definitely didn't realize things that I know now. But what you see is that there's a certain period of their life where in school, especially these prime ages, like the puberty ages that you mentioned, that at that point, the most significant influence on their life is going to be their peers who also know nothing about the world. No, and so if you surrender your kids to the school, surrender them to that peer motivated environment, you will lose them to the peers, and the peers are likely to continue to be the most influential people in their lives then and after.
Yeah, I completely agree. So, and nobody cares more about your kids, presumably, than you do. So
100%.
why pass off the most important responsibility you have to some government employee and a bunch of young chimpanzees? I
Right.
think it's crazy.
Yeah, and I think it's because it's all kind of behind a veil. When you're sending your kids to school, it's behind the veil, and you assume that there's something in there happening that's good and useful to the kids. During COVID, if you were paying attention as a parent, you got to see what exactly they were doing all day in class because it was on Zoom. So that if you looked, you could see there really wasn't much happening there. And there were some real destructive things happening. But, I think so. There's this veil of there's expertise on the other side and you can't do it. But I actually think it's so bad now that you'd be way better off to unschool your kids, which is literally give them no education and let their curiosity just sort of like go where it goes than you would be to send them to school now.
Yeah, exactly. And at this point, an unsolicited endorsement on my part, your son, Max, does an absolutely excellent weekly, more or less, I guess, a blog on what he's doing to educate and improve himself. And it's free, and people ought to subscribe to it. It's really good and really worthwhile and uplifting and encouraging. So what's the
It's
address? How do I
it's
do
it's
that?
it's on Substack, but you can get there by going to greatman.com is the URL it is.
Yeah,
Greatman.com. So
yeah.
awesome.
So yeah, it's on the right track, and you can see what Max is doing. And if your kid's not doing something like that, ask yourself, why not?
Okay. Next question is I have friends in Mexico and they forecast a really hard year with very little safe places on earth. So they see Mexico as a good place to be. They see it as a salvation, but because of the narcotics, the narcos and the army, they said there's been an ecosystem there so that you can manage to avoid the difficulty coming from the state, I guess, and still have a good life. And he says, so this war has made possible to introduce, sorry, I'm just kind of broken English. Question is, so Mexico is free from this woke nonsense and it's growing economically and its society still has its tradition. What's your opinion of it? He says for a Spanish guy, to establish himself in Mexico. What do you think about that as a place to go?
Well, I think, and I haven't lived in Mexico, so I'm not an authority, certainly, but it seems to me that to a greater degree than the US, Mexico is actually several different countries. Because if you go to the far south, where they have an independence movement among people of Indian background, that's a pretty different place than the Mexico on the US border. One's jungle, one's desert, one's all Indians. So I don't know. I don't have a real opinion. I know Jeff Berwick loves Mexico. His wife is Mexican. I think that helps. But of all the countries in Latin America, I mean, there might be better choices because they're all different. They're all very different from each other. They're at least as different as the countries of Europe are different from each other.
Okay. All right. Just a couple more questions here. Says, Doug, I'd like your take on the positive effect of mass uncontrolled immigration from hostile shithole third world countries on the West or to the West that it will have on increasing in-group preference and masculinity. He says, as extreme violence is inevitable and set to amplify, like what's the positive? Do you see any of that as positive?
Yeah, I don't see anything positive from mass immigration from shithole third world countries. Nothing, quite frankly, like take a tight little island like Ireland, for instance. I don't know how many third worlders are in Ireland today, but look, take Sweden. I mean, they've imported actively all these people from the Middle East and I don't know where, frankly. And they're almost all Mohammedan, and they hang together and they don't respect local laws, but they're supported by the local government on welfare. I mean, it's completely insane to take a stable society, and add an additional reason for conflict. I mean, some people, if they're white in Europe, are going to say, wait a minute, what are these black people doing here? And why do I have to pay for them? And it makes no sense. They're not earning their way. What are they doing here? I mean, it's pretty much the way the blacks feel in Africa about whites now. Oh, these colonialists, they came here, they stole our land. I mean, it's a formula for race hatred, not peaceful trade and gradual intellectual and economic intercourse between the two societies. It's like imposing one on the other and asking for trouble. I mean,
Seems like he thinks it will increase in-group preferences for the the native born population. You think that will be the effect, but the end result of that is more and more conflict that will get violent and not be good for anybody.
I think that people tend to pack up, and birds of a feather tend to flock together, and it's a formula for conflict.
Yeah.
So I have no problem with people of different races or different religions coming to live in different countries. I mean, I'm guilty of that myself, quite frankly.
Yep.
So
100%.
got nothing against it, but mass migration upsets the stability of a society. And frankly, everybody likes a certain degree of stability. And when you go out of your way to upset it, you're asking for trouble. And it seems like, especially today, there's a coterie of people. Generally, we can characterize them as woke or socialists or neo-Marxists or social. There's a lot of names for these people that, for some reason, hate Western civilization and are looking to overturn it. And playing the race card on a massive scale is one way to do it. And actually, playing the religion card too, something that I hadn't really thought of much in the past. You're overturning, look, everything in the world is being overturned, economically, financially, socially, demographically. But wait a minute, throughout all of recorded human history, one of the most important things in a society has been kind of a shared religious belief or opinions on what happens after you die and what the higher powers say we should do and behave. It's one of the things that bind a society together. And I'm not a religious person, but and Christianity's got all kinds of faults, which I'm happy to go into. But at this point, it's like Islam or Mohammedanism is being actively imported to the West. And they have very definite and firm beliefs that conflict. I'd say they even worship a different God, frankly. So that overturning the religious underpinnings of society, everything from not being allowed to say Christmas anymore, stuff like that. That's once again overturning the basis of the previous society. It's asking for chaos and trouble.
Wouldn't you say though that like the religion is more or less dead in Europe anyway, and I mean in the US it's weak. I mean Christianity, and so it's already been overturned at least by completely weakened, and it isn't even that Islam is, it's filling a vacuum. I mean, there's nothing there. There's no strong, religious moral framework that it's even running up against in opposition against. It's being allowed in by this woke ideology that then, that canceled Christmas and words like that and made sure that every religion is treated equally in the society and whatever, and just allowed it all to come in, and which of course backs to the immigration as well.
Yeah, there's no doubt about it. I mean, religion is the most basic tie that binds society together, kind of shared general religious beliefs. And they've been washed away completely in Europe. And people, it seems, we're genetically programmed to have some kind of religious beliefs. And since Christianity is really a dead duck in Europe, and Islam has very definite beliefs, yeah, it's being adopted in Europe. It will be adopted in Europe.
Yeah, seems hard to avoid. I just looked up the foreign-born percentage of the population in Ireland is 17% foreign-born, and 46% of them have arrived within the last 5 years.
Yeah, and it's one thing if they're, let's say, Poles. There were a lot of Poles in Ireland. I mean, they're ethnically almost indistinguishable from Irishmen, and they're Roman Catholics, and okay, not a big difference, quite frankly. Speak English with a different accent. But a lot of these people are from the Middle East and Africa. Totally different kettle of fish. Culturally, linguistically, racially, and religiously too. So not a good idea.
Okay, 2 more questions. Next one, guy says, what advice do you have for a family man that earns a better than average salary and can afford to speculate on the side, but cannot afford to pay off their mortgage anytime in the near future, which I guess he owes about $250,000 Canadian. Said, I want to be completely debt free, but I don't know how I can pay off this mortgage and be free of the burden. He says he's a 3rd generation family acreage in the country.
Well, look, a mortgage actually can be an asset depending on what interest rate you're paying for it. If you happen to have a 3% mortgage, which a lot of people do today, you can say that's not a liability, that's an asset, because the currency is losing value at, who knows, but maybe 10% per year. So point number one, a mortgage can be a good speculation, if you would. You just have to employ the money you got from the mortgage intelligently. Although generally speaking, I'm opposed to debt. I mean, and you got to ask yourself, are you in a position to speculate? Because if you have a job and you're not an entrepreneur, that's another mistake. You shouldn't have a job. You should have your own, you should find something you can do to be so you're your own employer. I mean, that's a more basic thing. And don't think about speculating because you're probably going to get your head handed to you. It's not easy, okay? So there's all kinds of problems that we have here.
Yeah, I think if you have money you think is available for speculation, I would take a little bit of that and invest it in trying to, come up with your own independent source of income.
Yeah, I've mentioned this before, but I'll say it again. It's too bad that the Yellow Pages no longer exist, because they were a wonderful and convenient way to look at all the businesses, page after page, in your area. And you should be asking yourself, what good or service can I provide to the guy that owns this business that'll make his life better? Because he'll pay me for it if I can solve his problems. Instead of being an employee where you're at the effect of what your employer wants to give you. So that's number one. Don't be an employee. Number two, I don't know the terms of your mortgage. Depending on your degree of sophistication and your income, it may actually be a good thing or a bad thing, although debt is a bad thing in general. So
Just don't
go into the stock market to speculate as a part-time endeavor. without a lot of background. I mean, you're likely to lose your savings. I mean, I hate to say something like that because speculation can treat you extremely well, but the odds are against you.
They are. Okay. All right. Good advice. Okay. So last question is, does Doug envision the next 4 years of life in America to unfold differently with a Republican versus Democrat in office? If there will be a difference, how do you envision it could play out on either side?
Well, I think we discussed that earlier to some degree.
Yeah.
This all revolves around Trump, this coming election, I think. But on the other hand, look, it's the uniparty. These Democrats and Republicans, they're political animals. They look out for number one first, and number one is they themselves. They don't give a damn about you. These are all lies. So the government has a life of its own at this point. And generally speaking, at least the Republicans aren't actively driving, forcefully driving towards a collectivist statist socialist world. They're like the Democrats, but they say, well, yeah, you're kind of right, but you're going too far too fast. So I guess if I had to choose between the two poisons, I'd take the more dilute poison, which is to say the Republicans. But it pox on both their houses, to hell with them. Don't think in those terms. That's a mistake. These people aren't a solution. They're the problem, both parties.
And fundamentally, does it end up in the same place regardless? I mean, still the economic realities must be dealt with no matter what political party is in charge, right? So, I mean, that's a factor that kind of supersedes any political party anyway, though they will have to deal with economic realities.
Yeah. And I'm of the opinion that the economy is going to go downhill more and more rapidly, and it's going to get grimmer. And it is predictable that the average American will want somebody to kiss it and make it better. He's going to look for a political solution. So the future for the next decade or so, at least in the US, I think it's going to be grim, really, really grim.
Yeah, I think so too. Okay. Well, on that happy note, we'll leave it here for today. We'll be back next week with more. Thanks, Doug.
Yep. God forbid we would end a podcast without a little bit of fear porn.
I'll find a positive thing for next time, I promise.